Umoja by the Emoji Equity Institute, Play Marin, and MAPS, Mapping Academic Pathways for Success at College Marin. My name is Professor Walter Turner. I'll be your host for today's Shore for Culture with our special guest, Davey D. Cook. We want to give a big shout out to Play Marin, and we also want to give a big shout out to MAPS, and we want to start with introducing Krista Sao from MAPS to say a few words. Welcome, Krista.
Hi, everyone. My name is Krista Tao, and I am a student peer mentor for the MAPS program, which is Mapping Academic Pathways to Success. And thank you for this opportunity to partner with Umoja for this event. MAPS is a mentoring program for first and second year students. We support students to navigate college, and we also help with career readiness, such as internships and programs. And we also have our own space on campus for the spring. And every student gets matched up with a peer mentor to meet with them regularly and help them with their with studying, with finals, and just be like a resource for students. And here is the link to apply in chat. And I hope I see you guys in the application. Thank you.
Krista, thanks so much, and we'll be continuing to collaborate with MAPS. Next, I want to introduce one of the representatives from the Umoja Learning Community. The Umoja Learning Community is part of the Umoja program at the College of Marin. The UEI is doing the institutional work of equity at the College of Marin, and the Umoja Learning Community is specifically focused on providing support for students, part of a statewide program, and we are joined by Tyler Sims, who is the administrative assistant for the Umoja Learning Community.
Hey everyone, I'm Tyler Sims. As Walter said, I am the administrative assistant here at College of Marin. Last semester, I was a graduate, so I am very versed in this program. Just to say a few things about the program itself, Umoja is a group of educators and learners who are committed to helping students grow academically, educationally, personally, and of course, career-wise. We also have our own mentoring program that was just launched this year, and we're working with students to get them individual peer mentoring so we can have them have the assistance throughout their time here at College Marin and through the rest of their educational futures.
You're going to see a poll pop up in just a second, and we're doing an assessment about who's here. So when you see that poll, take a moment and click on it. It should pop up any moment, and I'll keep going forward here. Davey D, we're very honored to have him as our guest today, as Shore for Culture, Music as Movement. He is a New York-born, award-winning journalist, radio producer, professor, hip-hop historian, and activist. He teaches courses at San Francisco State, Black Music in the 20th Century, hip-hop and social movements. He graduated from UC Berkeley. He's been instrumental in the founding of two major hip-hop institutions, the Bay Area Hip Hop Coalition and KPFA's award-winning Hard Knock Radio, which broadcasts every day of the week, Monday through Friday between 4 to 5 p.m. at KPFA 94.1 FM. Suffice to say, as I saw in an article, he is what we refer to as a hip-hop renaissance man and considered to be one of the hardest working men in hip-hop. He joins us at College of Marin today to speak on the intersections of music, politics, and education. He is the co-author, along with Jeff Chang, of a young adult version of Chang's seminal history, Can't Stop, Won't Stop. And he joins us today to share his thoughts and reflections from many years of work. Dave, thanks for making the time, and it's good to see you again.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me this afternoon, and big shout out to everybody that's here.
Okay, let's start. As part of our Showing Up series, we want people to know who they're talking to. We want to get some background here. So share with us some about your background growing up in the South Bronx, and how did music and culture become, and why did music and culture become a vehicle of voice for Davey D. Cook?
So there's two ways to look at this. One is just my personal journey. I grew up in the Bronx, New York. I lived in the Soundview section of the Bronx, which is part of the South Bronx. And, my earliest memories was hearing fire trucks, fire engines go by seeming like every minute. In the distance, you saw the orange glow of fires. And so, at the age that I was at, I didn't have a full understanding of what that was about. I just knew that there were fires everywhere in my neighborhood. And when you went to certain blocks, there were vacant lots and burnt out buildings. Now older, I can understand that I lived in an area that was ground zero for the burning of buildings. So landlords could make money and, insurance money, collect insurance money. Older, I understand that 30,000 buildings were burnt over a 10-year period. So as my childhood, I lived in an area which was ripe for what we now know as urban decay, and then gave way to what we now would understand to be urban renewal. Growing up, I didn't understand that there was a freeway that was separating our neighborhoods, the Cross Bronx Expressway. I didn't understand that freeway, which as a kid, we frequently would run across, 8 lanes to get from one part of our neighborhood to the other. We didn't understand that was a devastating design that would be replicated all around the country, from San Francisco to Oakland to Chicago. You pick a city. They all had similar type of challenges of people saying, let us build a freeway in the middle of these Black neighborhoods. So white folks who were participating in what we now know as white flight could leave this neighborhood and go to the suburbs and have a quick way to get from the inner city to, to where they were living. For me, this was all innocent. This was just a part of life. I didn't have the political awareness and, the words to describe what was going on. This was home. And so for me, it was exciting in the sense that during this period in the 1970s, there was a new form of music that was showing up. There were these block parties, and these block parties centered around DJs. Where I lived in the Soundview section, there was Disco King Mario. In another part of the Bronx, there was Africa Bambaataa. In another part of the Bronx, there was Kool Herc or Grand Wizard Theodore and the L Brothers. There were these colorful names, Baron and Breakout and the Funky Four plus one more. I could go on, but it was at these block parties that would take place that I started to fall in love with this thing that we now know as hip hop. At the time, my earliest recollection was hearing music that I didn't hear on the radio. It's like it was a bunch of drum beats. What is this? And everybody would do these acrobatic dances. Getting on the floor and putting your one leg behind your knee and twirling around. We called it corkscrewing or breaking at the time. I didn't understand why the DJs weren't playing things that we heard on the radio, but I do know that when I heard these sounds, they were better than what I was hearing on the radio. It was something that was infectious. We later came to know this percussive sound that was dominating my childhood as breakbeats. And we had names for the different breakbeats that were played. My foray into this was to be an MC. I started rapping probably in 77, 78. And that came about as people were saying, there are these MCs that are saying rhymes to this music. You should try your hand at it. And so I did, and became a part of a crew. The 2 crews, actually, one was called TDK, which was out of Co-op City section of the Bronx, and the other one was called the Avengers. And so I was actually pretty good at doing that, emceeing, saying my little rhymes. And what I understood at the time, that is, if you was good as an MC, you would get accolades. People would come up and give you a type of respect that was on par with somebody who could handle themselves in a fight. These are things that kind of gave you your props when you were coming up. So I was part of a couple of crews. I was a good MC. And that became something that motivated me to get better at. This was hip hop. We didn't call it hip hop in the 70s. It was going to the jam. It was going to the park. It was, going to the b-boy set. It was all these different names, but hip hop. That was a name that we attached to this thing later on in the 1980s. But in the 70s, it was a time of innocence. It was a whole big world to us of just, trying to create rhymes and get known by people in the neighborhood. It was a time in which you forgot about the poverty that you were living in. You forgot about the fires that were going on. You forgot about the gang violence that existed. You forgot about the challenges, the social and political challenges that were being hoisted systemically on an entire neighborhood or an entire group of people, because you were able to find a community, a nurturing community in this thing called hip hop. So I'm kind of combining a lot of things all at once because I have the advantage of hindsight. I'm able to look back 30, 40 years and say, this is what we did as a kid and give meaning to it. But at the time, if I look at my early journals, which I did keep, I just remember being fascinated and being enamored with going to these block parties, seeing a Grandmaster Flash, and then it was the Furious Four, seeing a Breakout and the Funky Four plus one more, and seeing a Shaw Rock, who was one of the first women MCs, do her thing, and that being the standard of success. Like one day we're going to be able to be known like Grandmaster Flash. One day I'm going to be able to say rhymes like a Shaw Rock, and who knew in 1977 and 1978, 79 that this type of activity would be something that would take hold all over the world. So that in a nutshell is kind of how I got started into hip hop. I'll close.
Then you come out to Berkeley, and you bring that out to Berkeley. I wanted to note in your book, you talk about Professor Roy Thomas, and you were referring to the journaling that you were doing. Where does this connection come about, Dave? This connection between music and culture and movement. And in an Oakland newspaper article I was reading, they were speaking with you. You said that this role that you did with the book was to make sure that you shared the social justice aspects of hip hop. Talk about that connection between culture, music, and movement as you know it.
Well, what we were doing was we were creating community at a time when our community was being dismantled and oppressed. In order to understand hip hop, you have to understand the political context in which it emerges from. So at the time, the Black Power movement was being dismantled. We didn't understand that was going on, but we knew that there was a lot of leaders that were no longer around. Our community was being flooded with heroin. We didn't understand why. We just knew that there were junkies in the park, and it was people that were involved with hip hop that were the ones removing themselves or removing those junkies from being within our midst. We knew that there was a fiscal crisis, and that in order to save money, 15,000 teachers were fired from the public schools. I didn't understand what it meant not to have a prom, or not to have driver's ed or any sort of trade classes when I was in high school, because what was the attraction for me was this thing called hip hop. Hip hop became the movement. Hip hop filled those voids for us. And when I was in the Bronx, I used to keep a journal. My parents moved out to Cali when I was still in high school, and I stayed in New York for my final 2 years, my junior and senior years of high school. I stayed with my grandparents over at Soundview Projects across the street from it. And when my mom left, she said, always keep a journal, because one day you'll be able to refer back to that and find yourself. It was when I was at UC Berkeley and I was writing my first term paper. I was encouraged by Roy Thomas to talk about this thing called hip hop. And I was able to go back to my journals and look at things that I was chronicling. I wasn't trying to chronicle hip hop per se when I was writing it, but because I was so involved, that was a big part of the subject matter. And it was within those journals, they became the basis for a lot of the things that we put in this additional copy of the book. It became the basis definitely for my thesis, in which I graduated from, because I was able to capture so much and look back and understand in hindsight, why certain things were happening. I didn't know about the politics of abandonment that we were experiencing, but I understood it now. I remember the police departments talking about New York was a city of fear and that they were passing out brochures. I didn't understand the political context of it, but now I understood that the police were trying to save them jobs and trying to prevent budget cuts coming to their department. So they put out a pamphlet and told everybody to be scared to come to New York. And they did, this whole slowdown. It made it seem like if you didn't keep the police on force, that all of New York would crumble, which is why kids like myself were the sacrificial lambs when they made these budget cuts to save money. I didn't understand that music had always played a central role in the lives of Black people, until my godparents were the ones that pulled me aside and said, taught me that music had a functionality above and beyond just being a record that was to be bought and sold, that it was ceremonial, that it built community, that it was sometimes a way in which we communicated to each other in a clandestine type of way, especially during slavery. All these things that, in the academy we talk about, we were experiencing on some form of fashion, but wasn't able to make that connection until I got into college, and people like Roy Thomas and even people like yourself, Walter, and others that helped me, really come into manhood and really, establish myself. I was able to learn and really come to appreciate. I didn't understand that that there was a Black Panther free breakfast program in the projects near where I lived. I didn't understand what that was about until I got older. It was like, oh, wow, that's why we knew about the Black Panther Party or the Nation of Islam or the Nation of Gods and Earth, then called the Five Percenters, or the Young Lords. These were people that were around. I didn't really understand who they were and what they were about until I got older and understood these were people that were trying to save our community and infuse some sort of political understanding to the dynamics that we were experiencing. And so hip hop has that in its DNA. And I'll close with this. As we moved on to answer your question about social movement, at various times throughout the evolution of hip hop, there was a certain type of intentionality that really played a key role in particular developments of this music and culture. It was an intentional act when people, for example, got together and had a huge gang truce, which opened up the doors for hip hop to really flourish. There was an intentionality when they said, let us combine the activities that people are doing and give it a name. Let's not just call it a park jam, but let's say the activities of dancing, breaking, the activities of emceeing or rapping on the mic, the activities of people putting art on the walls, graffiti or aerosol art, the activity of DJs doing these rearrangements of songs and playing breakbeat, turntablism. Let us umbrella that and call it hip hop. That was an intentional act. Adding a fifth element, which was knowledge. Understanding yourself, understanding your people's history. These were intentional things that came about with people who were a little bit older, who said there has to be some meaning to these activities that we're doing. It's more than just us dancing, but we're doing something that is trying to move us from point A to point B. If we fast forward to the mid 80s, there's a place in Manhattan called the Latin Quarter. And at the time, there were three things happening. One, there was an awareness about apartheid in South Africa. And there was, talk about how can we end that dreaded regime. There was a lot of people who were wearing gold chains who were having them snatched. And a lot of that gold was coming from South Africa. How can we get people to stop wearing gold chains? And there was intercommunal violence that was centered around a burgeoning crack trade, which New York was devastated with. And people were asking, how can we, come up with a new set of values? So at this place called the Latin Quarters in the, 1986, 87, there was a bunch of behind the scenes clandestine meetings. People didn't know about these meetings until years later. And it involved the early hip hop artists, Grandmaster Flash, KRS-One, MC Light, all these different people, Public Enemy, all meeting and figuring out what they were going to do with this thing that was now starting to become noticed around the country, this thing called hip hop. And it was in these meetings called Meeting of the Minds that people said, we're going to do a few things. One, we're going to make sure that we infuse knowledge in our songs. Two, when we do videos, we're going to have in the backdrop pictures or footage of heroes and sheroes that people should know. The most prevalent one, which you could see an example of that, is KRS-One, where he does the song My Philosophy. And in the backdrop, you see Malcolm X, you see, I think, Elijah Muhammad and a few other people. Queen Latifah in the song Ladies First. If you look at that, you see footage from, I think it was the Soweto uprising that is in there, as well as all these different women leaders, from Sojourner Truth to Winnie Mandela. These weren't accidental things. This was a result of people meeting behind closed doors and saying, we're going to use our platform. We're going to use our popularity. We're going to use the access that we have to big microphones to infuse knowledge into the public that we are talking to. And so now we call it the golden era of hip hop. And out of that comes Public Enemy. Out of that comes groups like X-Clan. Out of that comes KRS-One. And then further down the road, De La Soul, the Jungle Brothers, Tribe Called Quest, or Native Tongues. All that was very intentional, intentional movements by people who are looking at systems that were oppressing us and saying, here's ways in which we could fight back. In those meetings, people were saying, let's look at these books. Let's adopt a concept called Afrocentricity. Malafi Asante, that's the concept that he develops. People were looking at that and reading those books and looking at John Henrik Clarke and Leonard Jeffries and all types of scholars at the time who were centering Black people and centering Africanness. Those were the things that started to get reflected in hip hop. And if you go back to those eras, at that time, that was at the height of the crack era. That was at the height of the war on drugs. That was at the height when people were looking at hip hop and saying that it caused violence. And folks had a counter narrative that I think had an indelible mark on folks all around the world. If you look at that time period from 1986 to 1992, the golden era of hip hop, you can still feel the reverberations of that to this day. But again, that was people who were looking at a situation and saying, let us make a way out of no way. And they did that. So that was one aspect that came out of it in New York.
Dave, one of the things that you put in there, we talked the other day, I remember you from the days when you were at CalAX, which was a powerful program, you and Benny B and Siddiqui and Tamu, et cetera, which was setting a stage at that point. The point that you're raising now, as I read through the book last night, I noticed you mentioned meeting Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael at one of the summits. You mentioned the case of Sean Bell. You mentioned those cases when the voices of music and movement and culture were addressing equity, inclusion, and challenging white supremacy. Talk about that part, because that's some of the work we do here at the Equity Institute.
So part of the challenge that Black people and young people, and definitely people in our generation had always had, is how can we communicate to the masses? And how can we counter a narrative that is rooted in negativity and has been very popular for funding police task force and justifying a type of exclusion that many folks were suffering at. In other words, how do you get a hold of the big microphones? We understood that people like Dr. King was not successful without having access to a radio station, WERD, which was in the same headquarters as the SELC building that where his organization was housed. We understood that the Panthers weren't able to get everything out without their newspaper, or the Nation of Islam without their newspaper. And so what people understood was that forms of communication needed to be uplifted. And so that became a basis for folks using hip hop as a way to talk to the masses. These were the people that had those voices. So it wasn't just in song, even though there were a lot of people who had messages in the song. But what happens when you take those artists and you interview them? They were going to be well learned and have that knowledge. So a KRS-One, if he was part of the Stop the Violence movement, could break down why there was inner city violence. If it was Public Enemy, who was talking about apartheid in South Africa or police brutality, they were going to be able to do that and complement the work that they did with their songs. Or in their case, when they did, by the time we get to Arizona, articulate why they did a provocative video that showed why we needed to have King's birthday become a holiday. And the list goes on and on. Artists were beginning to understand that they had a way to reach the masses in a way that they were being denied in other arenas. And eventually they understood that many people were listening, people outside the community. And so that inspired people to do this even more. As we started to see the influence of hip hop, then you started to see people who were outside who said, how can we harness this power for our own needs? So you started to see candidates come along and see if they could get maybe a hip hop artist to appear on stage with them. You started to see folks maybe try to encourage a hip hop artist to maybe do a song or give an endorsement. All these things came into play. And I think hip hop artists, some were initially enamored with the attention, but eventually understood that they would have to, as Chuck D say, be men and women in their own rights and be accountable to their community and not just to people who are being opportunistic. And so if you fast forward, you started to see that artists started to change their roles. This is what we talk about in the book, that it was no longer just, we no longer just needed a Public Enemy to say, fight the power. We needed people in the community who were actually fighting the power to have these big voices. Okay. And so social media helped it, but also some of the artists were like, let me take a step back. And you members, you people that are part of, say, a Black Lives Matter chapter, why don't we bankroll you? Why don't we use our monies and our influence to push you to the forefront? And we don't have to necessarily be the folks that are articulating the needs and wants of a community. We can fall back and just be, the behind the scenes power for many of these movements. So when we talk about, what's happening today, most of the leaders that you see come out of hip hop. They don't necessarily have to be on the mic or behind the turntables to rap and do that. But I think artists themselves now understand that there's a role that they could play, very similar to the role that a Harry Belafonte and a Sidney Poitier played. Like, we make money, we can bankroll your thing. We can, help bring attention to the cause. We don't necessarily have to be the leaders per se that's in front of the cameras. In fact, we prefer to not be in front of the cameras and have to, to be the spokespeople. So we'll just fall back and do things behind the scenes. You saw that with Nipsey Hussle, T.I. The most prevalent example of this is David Banner. When Katrina happened and Young Jeezy saw that David Banner was trying to get money to people in Mississippi, and he started a thing called Heal the Hood. And when he couldn't get the proper papers done, Nelly stepped in and said, you can use my nonprofit. And Young Jeezy said, here's $250,000 for you to do what needs to be done. When David Banner mentioned that Young Jeezy gave him $250,000, Young Jeezy was a little upset. Don't tell people I did that. Just do what you need to do. When we had the Million Youth March and they were trying to shut it down, it was Master P that said, behind the scenes, I'll pay for it. Don't even worry about it. We got you covered. And it is that type of role that allowed community to really build and prosper. You all do what you all need to do to organize. We'll do what we need to do to make sure that you all are taken care of. And there's numerous examples that I could bring out, but I think that's the role that has taken place now.
This is part one of you, Davey D, at the College of Marin Umoja Equity Institute. You're going to be back for part two. You better be back for part two. If there are people who have questions, they can put questions in the chat. Let me slam a couple of
That one clip quick. I'm sorry.
Let me, if there are people who want to put questions in there, put questions in there. Two things. One thing, maybe hit us a bit on what you're doing with your class. I mean, you know, the Emoji Equity Institute is rooted in the College of Marin, so we're always interested in those voices and how they make it into the curriculum. But what is this moment right now? What is this moment? You have a chapter in there on global situation. What is this moment, this George Floyd, this Troy McCade, this Alex Nieto, this Elijah McClain moment? What is this moment right now? And how are you doing that in the class and in all the work that you do with the hip hop music and nationally and globally? Talk to us from your perspective.
We're sticklers for history, and we're sticklers for connecting the dots internationally. History is being challenged at every turn. I mean, you now have 30 states or 20 some odd states that, under the guise of critical race theory, which has nothing to do with history, but they define it that way, who are trying to remove history from the classes. You know, my other half is from Texas, so I spend a lot of time down there. And in those classrooms, you can barely talk about Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement without it, you know, being penalized and that being considered an act of rebellion or causing discomfort for students in the classroom. That's very real. Places like Tennessee, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they just celebrated or they looked at the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa race riots, or, you know, the massacres that took place. The kids there don't even get taught in school about that in their own neighborhoods. So making sure that people have a historical accounting of things is very, very important, that we make sure that folks know that hip hop and the things that we're talking about did not come out of a vacuum, but is part of a continuum. Understanding that there's a linkage to struggles. So, you know, in a place like the US, we like to think that we just did it by ourselves. No, we were very much connected to the freedom struggles that were taking place in various parts of the world to end colonialism. You know, what was going on in the continent? You know, what was the fight against apartheid? What was going on in places like Nairobi? Who were these leaders? Where were they getting their influence? What's going on south of the border in various countries throughout the Americas? What were the indigenous struggles? What were Black people's struggles in places like Brazil and other places? And how did they use cultural expression as a weapon? So we talk about that a lot in our classes so that people are very clear as to what they are a part of as a tradition, how resistance has always been in the forefront of our conversation, but when we talk about it in the mainstream, it becomes something that is damn near erased or demonized. So we talk about that a lot. We talk about the intentionality, which I mentioned, that people took upon themselves to really use culture as a tool to move the needle. So we go back to Dr. King, who was very clear about using culture as a weapon. We talk about Fela Kuti, who is very clear about using music as a weapon. We talk about why James Brown did his song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, because he had conversations and confrontations with the Black Panthers who were like, dude, you just can't be singing songs. You're gonna have to do some things for the people, and you're gonna have to use this talent to infuse some sort of inspiration and knowledge to the masses. And so when people understand that, then they can see themselves as being in the footsteps or following the footsteps of these people. We also try to bring to the forefront the role that women have played in these movements, because they've been erased, so we're very intentional about that. And so when we talk about a Dr. King or Huey Newton, we remind them about Kathleen Cleaver or Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer, and make sure that they understand those leaders, as well as those who are in the forefront in hip hop, who played key roles, from the Sister Soldiers on down to the Queen Latifahs, to the MC Lights, to Kool Herc's sister, Cindy Campbell, who was right alongside him when he was starting up this thing we call hip hop. So that's very important for us as well. We talk about the current leadership that is taking place, whether it's the folks in Ferguson, whether it's the people in Baltimore, the people right here in Oakland, from the Cat Brooks to the Alicia Garzas to the Tef Poes, the Linda Sassors, we can go on and on. We make sure that people understand that it's about teamwork and community building and not just one messianic figure. And then lastly, Walter, the other thing that we talk about is the systemic attacks. And we talk about the role that the state has played. And so we talk about COINTELPRO and how it was an undermining force. I show people the videos and the FBI papers where they specifically were targeting artists, like, hey, they came after Sam Cooke. They went after Sidney Poitier. Here's the FBI talking about in this video, we study culture. And you hear like a Darthard Perry say, we study culture. Why do you do this? Talking on behalf of the FBI. In order to control the people, you control the culture. You use the culture against them. We show them the papers that police have collected over the years on hip hop alone, so that they understand that this is not just a music form to be bought and sold, but they understand its potential. And that when you get involved with this culture, that you take it very seriously, because people all around the world have taken it very seriously. And so that's kind of the genesis of our class. And we go into deep detail over the 15 to 17 weeks that we do this. So it's not just the music, but it is a operating arm into the liberation struggles. We talk about the Black arts movement. We talk about the Harlem Renaissance, the intentionalities behind those two movements, the Black is Beautiful movement. We really go deep into all these different organizing eras in our, collective struggles.
Okay. Dave, what are some of the, we got a couple of questions here in the chat, and I want to throw these questions out, but I also want to ask you about the uniqueness of the Bay Area. I remember back in the day when you were here from New York, and you were in one scene in New York and it's another scene here. So say something about the Bay Area, about the independence of the Bay Area, but also this new generation of rappers. That's the question that's in here in the chat. In your opinion, does modern day hip hop serve a similar role than it did at its genesis? Where do you see hip hop going with the new generation of rappers? Where are the contemporary sites of resistance in hip hop? Do that and say something to us about the Bay Area, because we're in the Bay Area, in the town.
So the Bay Area has a lot to be proud of. It's contributed immensely to the evolution of hip hop. There are a few things that are going on, in particular with Oakland. When you look at different cities around the country, they all kind of have these personalities. Some cities feel like they're second city, so they're always trying to, escape the shadow of New York, which has always been a dominant Mecca type of place. Other people look at themselves like a Los Angeles, which is a major hub. So people try to, get out of the shadows or mimic the trajectory of that place. The Bay Area is 3,000 miles away from New York, so it's not trying to be like New York. It doesn't know nothing about New York. New York is not top of mind as it is when I'm back east and I go to the neighboring cities. It's definitely not trying to be like Los Angeles. It kind of has an independent streak that has always been reflected in the art. Part of that is seeing the cultural dynamics that I think were infused with younger generations because of the Black Panthers, which was born here, and the type of independence and innovativeness that they brought to the table, along with the diversity that we have here and the movements that have emerged, the free speech movement, the anti-war movement. All these different things have popped up that I think in the end of the day have given the Bay Area a DNA that says we're going to do for self. We're not waiting on New York and we're not waiting on LA. We will create our own thing. So if you had a TV show like Soul Train come on, in some of the cities I visited, it would be like, well, maybe one day Soul Train will come to our city and highlight us. In the Bay, it's like, we'll create our own Soul Train. So you had the Jay Payton show, and later on you had Soul Beat, and you had people trying to do their own things. How that's reflected in the artists is that many people came up and said, we're not waiting for to be signed by a label in New York. We'll do our own thing. We'll make our own money. We'll figure out how to do this ourselves. We're hustlers, hustlers all the way around. We're not sitting here waiting. And so you found a certain type of independent that was reflected in economic independence. So when you look at the models that Too Short or E40 have laid down, or then later Hyro and Living Legends, they're success stories that many people have emulated all around the country. You go around the country, they say, we were watching Too Short. We saw what he was able to do. We were watching E40. We saw what they were able to do. We were watching Hammer and what they were doing, and we emulated that. And that's a really big deal for the Bay. How that is infused in movements is that I think the organizing structure that had come from some of the movements I talked about in the past have been built upon. And so you see a certain type of way in which people have attacked problems to be self-sustained, as well as figuring out how you can influence and impact some of these other levers of power. So if you look at the laws we got passed here, whether it's getting police out of schools or whether it's getting certain bills passed in the aftermath of certain tragedies like Oscar Grant, those are landmark things that should be celebrated. And I know people are looking at and saying, how did you all do that? We need to do that here. So to me, there's a lot to really be thankful for. And then there's a certain amount of innovation aesthetically that the Bay has brought to the table. There's a style of rap that's reflected in groups like Hieroglyphics or Living Legends that has become something that people can nod their head and say, we need to be like that. They're instrumental in funk musicianship that has been reflected in many of the producers, whether it's Denny McElroy and Thomas McElroy and Danny Foster, who did In Vogue and Club Nouveau, or maybe it's Kyrie or Ant Banks, and the list goes on, where people have been like, we need to get a hold of that type of style of production and this type of sound because it's free of samples, it reflects a funk aesthetic, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot. And then lastly, the dance. There were dance styles that go all the way back to the 1960s that have come out of the Bay, the boogalooing, the strutting, the roboting, that is now a part of hip hop, repertoire. And that's all Bay Area based. So there's a lot to be proud of and to really uplift.
In the modern day, to the questions that people asked in the chat about the role of modern day hip hop, and do something for us here in our last several minutes. Talk a bit about the thought here. Does modern day hip hop have a similar role to that? And also talk about intergenerational unity. I think you talked about that. You said that Chuck D was 60 and Master P, et cetera. So the links there between the social justice mission and where we are now in the past.
So hip hop has a couple of challenges that are going on. There is commercial hip hop, corporate hip hop that is presented to the masses, that is very much following the formula of the music industry of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and controversy. That's their success formula. So they're looking at anything that could fulfill that ethos, and they're presenting that to the masses and then labeling it hip hop and saying this is the totality of the culture. That's a challenge. It's been diluted, watered down, and the main consumers are people outside the Black community. So it's done for their consumption. Most people who are deep into this culture understand that having access to the airwaves and to those mainstream platforms is not going to happen. So they've fallen back behind the scenes, and I think hip hop is more vibrant than it's ever been. There's an international aspect to it. What's the exchange between us and Nigeria? What's the exchange between us and Ghana? Many people have been going back and forth to the continent. What's the exchange between us and Brazil? A lot of people are doing this international thing that never sees the light of day. People are also understanding that it's okay just to be an organizer, that you don't have to be an entertainer. You don't have to always rap and sing a song, but you can just organize. So I look at people like out of Ferguson, like T-Dub and Tef Poe and Phil Agnew and all these people who are doing incredible organizing, where they have all the bells and whistles and all the I's dotted and T's crossed in the work that they're doing, in addition to being skilled artists. So they don't feel like every song has to have a message, but they're looking more at, can we do this free breakfast program? Can we do this book giveaway? Can we build some infrastructure? Can we create things that are going to be self-sustained. When I look at the late Nipsey Hussle and him building with T.I. and all these artists, and they were like, let's get athletes, let's get artists, and let's get business people together, and let's buy a property, right? So, you know, what Nipsey was doing in Leimert Park or Crenshaw, where his store was at, was just one of many examples of people that were doing that all around the country. T.I. was doing it. David Banner was doing it. Athletes like Marshawn Lynch and others were doing that. Sometimes it was well known, sometimes it wasn't. What Rough Riders were doing, where they were buying up entire properties, Dougie Fresh, all this sort of stuff, so people can have an economic base to build off of, is important. So diversifying your portfolio, being more than just a singer or a rapper, but being a business owner, a landowner, all these types of things is where I see that happening. And it's not always going to be celebrated and talked about. It's not always going to be the first thing that is bantered about in mainstream platforms, but it doesn't diminish the fact that I know movements that can point to particular artists and say, that artist there is the reason why we're able to do these actions. They made $1 million and they gave it to us after they did their tour so that we can do the work at hand. And that, I think, is very important. Lastly, I will say that you can find tons of artists who have content that is addressing the issues of the day. It might be a Saw Rock, or it might be a Mumu Fresh. It might be locally here, a Deuce Eclipse. It might be a Boots Riley. We can go on, or Ryan Nicole, Rocky Rivera, Bamboo. I mean, we can go on and on where there's all sorts of complex social and political issues that are being addressed with people who actually sell out shows. Like, they're not hurting. The only thing is that you don't hear them on local radio stations. You don't see them being, bantered about at some of these big award shows, but their impact is felt. And many people know them because they understand that as artists, they have to do more than just sing and dance, but they have to have a presence in their respective communities. And I see that happening, and I'm very excited about it. But it definitely sometimes gets overshadowed by the mainstream perspective of negativity that is often, bantered about with corporate, institutions.
Okay. And you can listen to Davey D as part of Hard Knock Radio every Monday through Friday from 4 to 5 at KPFA 94.1 FM. You can go to his website. What's your website? The live one where you're doing all the interviews, Dave. What's that site?
So we have hardknockradio.org. That's one site. We have mixcloud.com, Hard Knock Radio, where you can see many of our archives. I have Hip Hop and Politics as a website as well. But to catch up on our shows, you can usually find it at mixcloud.com/Hard Knock Radio. And, we're on it, every day at kpfa.org or 94.1. So those are the main things.
When do you sleep, Dave?
When do I sleep?
You're busy. When do you rest?
Yeah, between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. is when I sleep.
Okay.
Unless I got interviews on the East Coast, and I'm up at 5.
I appreciate that, Dave. We want to thank Can't Stop, Won't Stop, the Young Adult Vision, Jeff Chang and Davey D. Cook, a longtime friend and associate. Dave, I appreciate you. We want to give a big shout out to Play Marin and Paul Austin. And we need to introduce you to Paul Austin. You need to be in contact with Paul Austin and Play Marin. They're doing some amazing work over here in Marin County in all different formats. We want to give a big thank to MAP. We want to thank the Emoji Learning community. We want to thank Tyler for coming on. We want to thank the Emoji Equity Institute. We want to thank all the attendees. We want to give a big shout out to the College of Marin. And we want to give a special thanks to you, Dave, for not just being a sprinter, but being a long distance runner in this movement to change the world. And
thank you for having me. And I hope it made sense. I know I was trying to cram a lot in a few minutes.
It always makes sense, Dave. I mean, don't worry about it, because this is like part 1A of you coming to the Emoji Equity Institute. There's going to be a 1B. You're going to be back here. You know how to reach me. I know how to reach you.
Okay.
You know the Umoja people, and we're going to keep it doing. Dave, much respect.
Thank you very much, everybody. Peace out.
All right.